This poor little homeless girl asks a billionaire to pay for her college. But when the billionaire hears this, he has an unexpected reaction. And what happens next is even more shocking. Comment what you think will happen. Subscribe to my channel and support my work. The twilight of New York City began as George Halston left his office on the top floor of one of the most luxurious buildings on Fifth Avenue. At 47 years old, owner of one of the largest consulting firms in the country, he maintained a rigorous routine that he rarely broke. That evening, however, something was bothering him. The silence of the panoramic elevator seemed to amplify the thoughts he was trying so hard to ignore. It had been exactly 7 years since Claire, his wife, had passed away. Since then, George had plunged into a world of business and numbers, turning pain into profit, loneliness into business success. His face, once known for warm smiles, now carried a permanent expression of indifference. The oldest employees whispered about how he had changed, how his blue eyes, once so lively, now looked like two frozen lakes. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, George adjusted his Italian tie and walked towards the exit. The doorman, a gray-haired gentleman who had worked there for decades, gave a slight bow that was answered only with a discreet nod. Outside, his driver was already waiting for him with the car door open. "Home, sir?" asked the driver. George hesitated for a moment. The thought of returning to that empty mansion in Greenwich made his stomach churn. "No, John, I'm going out. To dinner tonight. Take me to the Gilded Lily." The Gilded Lily was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, frequented only by the New York elite. George used to go there with Claire. Since her death, he had avoided the place, but that night something compelled him to break that self-imposed rule. The restaurant maintained the same elegance he remembered. Venetian glass chandeliers hung from the ceiling, creating a hypnotic dance of light on the dark oak tables. The maitre d' immediately recognized him and led him to his usual table near the window overlooking the indoor garden. George ordered a bottle of the most expensive wine in the house, not because he particularly appreciated that label, but because the exorbitant price gave him a false sense of control over his life. As he waited, he watched the other patrons. Elegant couples, executives closing deals, families celebrating special occasions. Everyone seemed to have a purpose for being there. Everyone except him. The wine arrived, and with it came the leather-bound menu. George had barely begun to browse it when he heard a commotion near the entrance of the restaurant. He looked up in time to see two security guards trying to prevent something or someone from entering. That's when he saw her for the first time. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, managed to slip between the guards' legs and ran towards the main hall. Her dark hair was disheveled, her torn clothes barely covered her thin body, and her bare feet left marks on the immaculate carpet. The security guards ran after her, but the girl was agile. She weaved between the tables with surprising dexterity, ignoring the horrified looks of the patrons. George watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and discomfort until he realized that the girl was heading directly for his table. Before he could react, she grabbed the sleeve of his Italian suit with surprising strength. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, met his. George tried to pull away, but something in that child's expression paralyzed him. "Pay for my college. Please," she begged, her voice trembling. George blinked several times, sure he had misheard a 6-year-old beggar asking for college. The security guards finally reached the girl, ready to drag her out. George raised his hand, signaling them to stop. There was something about that child, something in her gaze, that intrigued him deeply. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself and everyone around him. "Michelle," she replied, still holding tightly to his suit. "And I need to study. I really need to." It was then that George noticed something even more surprising. As the girl spoke, her eyes scanned the table and stopped at the financial newspaper he had left there. For a brief moment, she seemed absorbed in the headlines, as if she were reading them. "You can read?" he asked, frowning. Michelle let go of his sleeve and, to everyone's astonishment, picked up the newspaper. Her dirty fingers ran along the lines of text, and she began to read aloud with impressive fluency. Financial market reacts positively to the new monetary policy. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. The security guards exchanged confused glances. The nearby patrons stopped their conversations to observe the unusual scene. George felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. "Where did you learn to read like that?" he asked, indicating that the security guards could step away. Michelle hugged the newspaper against her chest as if it were her most precious possession. Her eyes, once desperate, now shone with something different. Pride, perhaps. "At the library," she replied. "I go there every day. I read everything I can. Math is my favorite. Yesterday I was studying Fibonacci sequences and—" George raised his hand, interrupting her. "Fibonacci sequences? You know what that is?" Michelle nodded and, to prove her point, began to explain the mathematical concept with a precision that would embarrass many adults. George felt his heart race. In 7 years, nothing had managed to spark his interest in this way. That's when he noticed that the girl was trembling, not from fear, he realized, but from hunger. Her face was pale, and despite the haughty posture as she spoke of mathematics, it was evident that she was about to faint. "Sit down," he ordered, pulling the chair next to him. The other patrons began to murmur in disapproval, but George ignored them. Michelle hesitated for a moment, looking at her dirty feet, clearly aware that she did not belong in that environment. "Sit down," he repeated, this time more gently, "and tell me more about what you're reading." The girl finally obeyed, still holding the newspaper as if her life depended on it. The maître d' approached, visibly disturbed by the situation, but a look from George was enough to keep him at bay. "Sir," began Michelle, her voice now firmer, "I know I shouldn't be here, but I really need to study. My mum—" Her voice faltered, and large tears began to roll down her dirty face. George felt something inside him break, something that had remained frozen for 7 long years. "Continue," he said, surprising himself with the softness of his own voice. Michelle took a deep breath, wiped the tears with the torn sleeve of her blouse, and began to tell her story. A story that, without George knowing it at that moment, would forever change the course of their lives. Michelle lowered her eyes to the plate of food that George had ordered for her. It was the first decent meal she had had in weeks, but even so, she hesitated to eat. Her small, dirty hands trembled as she held the silver cutlery, so different from the broken pieces of plastic she was used to. "My mum's name was Irene," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "She got very sick. She tried to work until she couldn't get out of bed anymore." George watched every movement of the girl, noting how, despite her situation, she maintained a poise that many of the restaurant's patrons did not possess. There was a dignity in her suffering that impressed him. "We lived in a small apartment," Michelle continued, now playing with the food on her plate. "Mom always said that education was the most important thing in the world. Even when we didn't have anything to eat, she would take me to the library. She said that the mind needed nourishment as much as the body." The girl paused, and George realized that she was struggling to hold back tears. Without thinking, he extended his silk handkerchief to her. Michelle took it carefully, as if it was something too precious to touch. "3 weeks ago," her voice faltered. "Mom didn't wake up. I kept calling, but she was so cold." George felt his heart clench. The image of a 6-year-old child alone with her mother's body was too devastating to bear. "And then?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The neighbors called people who took her away. They said they were going to take care of me too, but I ran away. I didn't want to go to a place where I couldn't study, so I went back to the library. It's the only place where I feel close to her." Michelle finally began to eat, as if telling her story had given her permission to accept help. George watched her, millions of thoughts passing through his mind. How could someone so young have so much maturity? How could a child who barely had anything to eat be so concerned with education? "You said you want to go to college," he commented, trying to steer the conversation to something less painful. "What do you want to study?" Michelle's face lit up, and for the first time, George saw a genuine smile on her lips. "I want to study everything," she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting her sadness, "but especially math and physics. Did you know that there are 11 possible dimensions in the universe? I read about it in a string theory book at the library. And I also want to study medicine, because maybe that way I can help people like my mom." George almost choked on his wine. "String theory? You understand that?" "More or less," she replied with disarming honesty. "Some parts are difficult, but I write down everything I don't understand and then look for other books that explain it better. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, sometimes helps me find easier books on complicated subjects." He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A street child discussing quantum physics while eating what was probably her first meal in days. It was too surreal. "Can you show me this library?" he asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Michelle hesitated. "It's closed now. It only opens tomorrow at 8 o'clock. It's where I used to sleep, on the sidewalk in front. But since they took the books I used to use as a pillow, I've been sleeping in other places." Where did you sleep yesterday?" The girl looked away, and George realized that she didn't want to answer. Her silence said more than any words. "You can't keep going on like this," he said, surprising himself with the firmness of his decision. "I'm going to arrange a place for you to stay." "No!" Michelle almost shouted, startling the customers at the nearby tables. "Please, don't send me to any institution. They don't let us study what we want. They only want us to learn basic things. I need to learn more. I need to grow. I need to—" "Calm down," interrupted George, noticing the panic in her voice. "I'm not going to send you to any institution. I have a big house with several empty rooms. You can stay there while I sort out your legal situation." Michelle stared at him suspiciously. "Why are you trying to help me?" The question caught George off guard. Why really? He, who for years had lived isolated in his world of numbers and businesses, why was he offering help to a street girl? The answer came like a whisper from the past in the voice of Claire. "Sometimes, George, the greatest opportunities in life come disguised as problems that everyone wants to avoid." "Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten," he replied finally. "That knowledge is the most precious thing someone can have, and that wasting a brilliant mind is a greater crime than any other." Michelle continued to stare at him as if trying to read his soul. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Can I take some books with me?" she asked in a low voice. George couldn't contain a small smile. "As many as you want. I have a private library that you can use." Her eyes widened at the mention of a private library, but soon her expression changed to something darker. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling again. "About my father." George felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in her tone of voice that alarmed him. "Your father?" "Yes," replied Michelle, now almost whispering. "Tony, he's not a good person, and if he finds out that someone is helping me—" She didn't complete the sentence, but she didn't need to. The fear in her eyes said everything George needed to know. At that moment, he made another decision that would change his life forever. "Don't worry about him now," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "Let's solve one thing at a time." But as he called the maitre d' to pay the bill, George couldn't. avoid the feeling that he was getting involved in something much bigger and more complicated than he imagined. What had begun as a solitary dinner in an elegant restaurant was about to turn into a journey that would test not only his patience and his resources, but mainly his ability to care about someone again. As they left the restaurant, Michelle instinctively grabbed his hand when she saw the dark street. Her small, fragile touch awakened in George an instinct for protection that he didn't know he still possessed. But as they walked towards the car, he didn't notice the shadowy figure watching them from across the street, nor did he imagine that his decision to help that bright little girl would trigger a series of events that would put them both in danger. On the way to his mansion in Greenwich, George watched Michelle in the rearview mirror. She had fallen asleep almost instantly in the back seat of the car, still clutching the newspaper she had read at the restaurant. Her face, even dirty and marked by suffering, conveyed a peace that only childhood sleep can provide. George called his driver. "I need you to do some shopping tomorrow very early. Clothes, shoes, school supplies, everything a child might need." The driver, who had worked for him for more than a decade, only nodded, but George noticed his surprised look in the mirror. It was the first time in 7 years that his boss had shown any kind of concern for someone other than himself. Arriving home, George carefully carried Michelle so as not to wake her. She weighed so little that he barely felt her body in his arms. Climbing the stairs towards the bedrooms, he passed by the photo of Claire hanging on the wall. For a moment, he was sure he saw a different smile on his late wife's face, as if she approved of his decision. But as he settled Michelle into one of the guest suites, George couldn't imagine that his life was about to turn into a nightmare. The girl's words about her father echoed in his mind like a dark omen. Who was Tony really? And why did Michelle show so much fear when mentioning his name? Michelle's first night in the Halston mansion revealed to George how unprepared he was to take care of a child. 3 times, he woke up startled by screams coming from her room. Each time, he found Michelle sitting on the bed, trembling and calling for her mother. The 3rd time, it took her almost an hour to calm down. "Sorry," she murmured, clinging to the pillow. "I didn't mean to wake you up again." George sat on the edge of the bed, feeling completely lost. What do you say to a child who has just lost her mother? How do you comfort someone who has already suffered so much in so little time of life? "Do you want to tell me about the nightmare?" he asked, trying to sound gentle. Michelle hugged the pillow tighter. "It was about the day Mom didn't wake up, but this time he was there too." "He? Your father?" The girl shuddered at the word father, her eyes, still red from tears, filled with fear. "Tony is not my father," she said with surprising firmness. "Mom always said that. She said he was just her husband, but not my real father." George frowned. "What do you mean?" "She told me once, when he had disappeared again. She said that my real father was a good man who died before I was born. Tony appeared later, when I was a baby. At first he was nice, but then..." Her voice faded away, and George realized that she was trembling even more. "What did he do, Michelle?" "He hurt Mom," she whispered. "When he drank, he got very angry. He broke everything in the house. And when I was 4 years old, I tried to defend her. He threw me against the wall." George felt his blood boil. The idea of someone hurting a child like that filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "Is that why you ran away from him?" Michelle nodded. "Mom waited for him to fall asleep one night, and we ran away. We came to New York. He never knew where we were, but now..." "Now what?" "Now that Mom is dead, I'm afraid he'll find me. He always said that if we ran away, one day he would find us, that he would take revenge." George got up and began to walk around the room, trying to organize his thoughts. The situation was much more complex than he imagined. It wasn't just a matter of giving shelter to a street girl. He was dealing with a child who was running away from a violent man. "Michelle," he said, stopping in front of the bed, "I need you to tell me everything you know about Tony. Any information may be important." The girl hesitated, but began to speak. Gradually, a terrible story was unfolding. Tony was an unstable man with a history of violence. He drank a lot and had connections with dangerous people. Michelle didn't know his real last name. He always used different names. "But there's one thing," she said, her voice trembling. "He has a mark on his neck, a big scar, and a dragon tattoo on his right arm." George mentally noted these details. First thing in the morning, he would hire a team of private investigators. He needed to know exactly who he was dealing with. "You are safe here," he assured her, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The house has 24-hour security, cameras everywhere. No one will hurt you." Michelle looked around the luxurious room, larger than the entire apartment where she lived with her mother. "Why are you doing all this for me?" The question caught George off guard. For a moment, he saw himself reflected in that child's eyes. The same loneliness, the same pain of losing someone he loved. Maybe that was what had touched him so much. "Because sometimes," he replied after a long silence, "people need each other, even if they don't know it at first." The next morning, George woke up early and found Michelle already awake, sitting in the library on the ground floor of the mansion. She was completely absorbed in an advanced physics book that certainly shouldn't make sense to a child her age. "Good morning," he said, watching how she already looked different after a bath and wearing the new clothes that John had bought very early. "Good morning," she replied, without taking her eyes off the book. "Did you know that light can behave as both a wave and a particle at the same time? Isn't that amazing?" George couldn't help but smile. Her ability to focus on knowledge even amidst so much chaos was admirable. "Michelle," he called, sitting in a chair nearby, "we need to talk about some important things." She finally closed the book, although she kept a finger marking the page. "First," he continued, "I'm going to hire a private tutor for you. Someone who can assess your level of knowledge and help you prepare to enter a suitable school." Her eyes lit up. "Really? Can I choose what I want to study?" "Within reason, yes, but we also need to take care of your legal situation. I'm going to look for a lawyer today to start the process of temporary guardianship." Michelle's smile disappeared. "What if he shows up? What if he finds out where I am? That's why I need you to stay inside the house for now. I know it may seem like a prison, but it's for your safety. We have a pool, a garden, lots of books, and I promise it won't take long." She nodded, although she seemed worried. "Can I at least go to the public library to say goodbye to Mrs. Thompson? She must be worried about me." George thought for a moment. The librarian could be an important source of information about Michelle. "Let's do this. This afternoon I'll go with you there. But we need to be quick and discreet." Her face lit up again. "Thank you. There are so many books I want to return." "You can keep them," interrupted George. "In fact, I'm going to make a donation to the library so they can buy new books." Michelle jumped out of the chair and, to the surprise of both, hugged George. It was the first time she had shown this kind of affection, and he didn't know how to react. The afternoon arrived quickly, and they drove to the library in one of George's less flashy cars. Michelle was in the back seat, practically jumping with anxiety. The library was located in a simple neighborhood, far from the luxury of Greenwich. It was an old building with a peeling facade that desperately needed renovation. As they entered, they were greeted by a white-haired lady with thick-rimmed glasses. As soon as she saw Michelle, her face lit up. "My God, girl, where have you been? I was so worried." Mrs. Thompson hugged Michelle tightly, and George noticed tears in her eyes. "After I heard about your mother, I looked for you everywhere. even called social workers, but no one could find you." While Michelle told a shortened version of the recent events, George observed the interaction between the two. It was evident that the librarian had a special affection for the girl. "Mr. Halston," said Mrs. Thompson after hearing everything, "I need to show you something." She went to her desk and returned with a battered notebook. "This belonged to Irene, Michelle's mother. She asked me to keep it, said it was important." George took the notebook carefully. Before he could open it, however, a noise at the entrance of the library caught his attention. A tall man, with a visible scar on his neck, was standing in the doorway. Michelle's scream of terror confirmed his worst fears. It was Tony, and he wasn't alone. Time seemed to freeze inside the library. George instinctively put Michelle behind him while Mrs. Thompson clutched the phone in her trembling hands. Tony remained standing at the entrance, his dark eyes scanning the room until they fixed on Michelle. A cruel smile formed on his lips. "Long time no see, Princess," he said, his hoarse voice carrying a tone that made George feel nauseous. "Daddy missed you." Michelle shrank even further behind George, clinging to his jacket so tightly that her little fingers turned white. She was shaking so much that George could feel the vibrations through the fabric. "You're not my father," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Tony's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression that made even George take a step back. The man took a step forward, revealing his appearance better. In addition to the scar on his neck, which seemed even more frightening up close, his clothes were dirty and rumpled. The smell of alcohol emanated from him even at that distance. "Don't be rude, Princess," he snarled. "Didn't your mother teach you good manners?" "Oh, that's right. She can't teach you anything anymore, can she?" George felt Michelle sob behind him. The cruelty of those words filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in a long time. "You need to leave," he said, keeping his voice steady. "This is a public library and you are disturbing the peace." Tony finally turned his attention to George, analyzing him from head to toe. His eyes lingered on the gold watch on George's wrist, on the impeccable cut of his suit. "And who are you?" he asked, tilting his head to the side like a snake about to strike. "Irene's new boyfriend? No, wait, she's dead. So you must be the sucker who's bankrolling the little genius here." Mrs. Thompson took advantage of the distraction to discreetly press a button under her desk. George knew she was calling security, but he also knew it would take a few minutes for them to arrive. "My name is George Halston," he replied, trying to buy time, "and I'm arranging legal guardianship of Michelle." Tony's laughter echoed through the empty library, a harsh, joyless sound. "Legal guardianship? Do you really think you can take my daughter away from me?" "She is not your daughter," repeated George, his voice firmer now, "and you have no rights over her." The cruel smile returned to Tony's face. "I have all the rights, you idiot playboy. My name is on her birth certificate, and you know what else? I have proof that Irene prevented me from seeing my daughter for years. It's called parental alienation. I can make your life a living hell in court." George felt his stomach sink. He hadn't considered this possibility. If Tony really had legal registration as Michelle's father, the situation was much more complicated than he imagined. That's when he felt Michelle move behind him. Before he could stop her, she stepped forward. "You used to hit my mom," she said, her voice small but firm. "I remember everything, and I'm going to tell everyone." Tony's expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared, replaced by something much more dangerous. "You've always been too smart for your own good, you little brat," he snarled, taking a step forward. "Just like that bitch of a mother of yours, always thinking she was better than everyone else with her books and stupid dreams." George pushed Michelle back behind him. "Don't you dare take another step." Tony stopped, but his smile returned, even more sinister. "Or what? Are you going to hit me with your Rolex? Sue me with your expensive lawyers?" He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "You know what this is? Her birth certificate, with my name right here as the father. How much do you think the newspapers would pay for a story about how the great businessman George Halston is trying to steal the daughter of a loving father?" George felt his blood run cold, not by the threat itself, but by the calculated malice behind it. That man wasn't there for Michelle. He was there because he saw an opportunity for extortion. "How much do you want?" asked George, his voice low and controlled. Tony's smile widened. "Now we're talking the same language. How about we start with—" He was interrupted by a sharp scream. Michelle had broken away from George and was running towards the back of the library. Tony reacted instantly, jumping over a table to try to reach her. George ran after him, but Tony was surprisingly agile for someone who smelled of booze. Mrs. Thompson began to scream for help, but her voice seemed distant as George chased Tony through the corridors between the shelves. Michelle knew the library well and moved quickly between the shelves, knocking books down behind her to hinder the pursuit. That's when George heard a sound of breaking glass. Michelle had found a small window at the back of the library, one of those old ones that open for ventilation, too small for an adult, but enough for a skinny child like her. "No!" shouted George, watching with horror that the window opened onto an alley. But Michelle was already squeezing through the opening. Tony arrived before George and tried to grab her ankle, but only managed to tear the hem of her pants. With an agility born of desperation, Michelle managed to get through the window and fell on the other side. George finally reached the window, in time to see Michelle getting up and running down the alley. She was limping slightly. The fall must have hurt her leg. Tony let out a roar of rage and ran back to the entrance of the library. "You're not going to escape me, you little pest!" he shouted. George ran back too, his heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. When he arrived at the entrance of the library, he saw 3 police cars parking. Mrs. Thompson must have called not only security, but also the police. Tony, seeing the cars, abruptly changed direction and disappeared down a side street. 2 police officers ran after him, while others entered the library. "My priority is the girl," George said to the officer who was trying to collect his statement. "She's alone, hurt, and terrified. We need to find her first." The officer nodded and began to organize a search of the area. George took out his cell phone and began to make calls. In minutes, he had several private security guards and investigators searching the area. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, George's despair increased. There was no sign of Michelle anywhere. The little genius who had impressed him so much was lost on the streets of New York City, fleeing a violent man who now knew she was worth a lot of money. Mrs. Thompson approached him, carrying the notebook she had tried to give him before. "She'll be back," said the lady, placing the notebook in his hands. "Michelle is stronger and smarter than we imagine, but while we're looking for her, I think you need to read this. It will help you better understand what we're fighting against." George looked at the battered notebook. On the cover, in delicate handwriting, was written, "Irene's diary for my Michelle, when it's safe to tell the truth." He opened the notebook with trembling hands, but before he could begin to read, his cell phone rang. It was one of his investigators. "Mr. Halston," said the voice on the other end of the line, "I think we found something. You need to see this immediately." George followed the investigator through a series of narrow alleys in the library neighborhood. Night was already beginning to fall, bringing with it a fine drizzle typical of New York. He clutched Irene's notebook to his chest, protecting it from the rain as he tried to keep up with the investigator's fast pace. "We found some witnesses," explained the man as they walked. "Street children who knew Michelle from the time she frequented the library. One of them said she knows where she might be hiding." They stopped in front of a small bar, where a girl of approximately 12 years was waiting for them. She looked suspiciously at everyone, as if she feared being seen. "This is Nancy," introduced the investigator. She knew Michelle from the library. George knelt down to be at the girl's height, ignoring the fact that his Italian suit was being ruined by the dirty water on the sidewalk. "Do you know where Michelle is?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the anxiety that consumed him. Nancy studied his face for a few seconds before answering. "Are you the rich man who was helping her?" "Yes, it's me, and I'm very worried. She's hurt, and that man—" "Tony," interrupted Nancy, and George noticed how she shuddered when saying, "The name. We know him. He's a very bad man. When Michelle's mother was still alive, he sometimes appeared around here looking for them. We always warned Mrs. Irene to hide." George felt his heart clench. How many people knew of the terror that Michelle and her mother lived? How many had helped in silence, doing what little they could? "Nancy," he said gently, "I need to find Michelle before him. She's hurt and scared. Please." The girl bit her lip, still hesitant. "Michelle is different from us, you know. While we were playing, she was always reading. Sometimes she tried to teach us things from her books. She talked about stars, numbers, things we didn't even understand, but she never treated us like we were dumb." Tears began to form in Nancy's eyes. "She taught me to read. She spent hours helping me with the letters. She said that knowledge was a treasure that no one could steal from us." George felt his own throat tighten. Even in her precarious situation, Michelle found strength to help others. "There's a place," continued Nancy finally, "a place where she went when she was very sad. After her mother died, she stayed there for a few days before she started sleeping, in front of the library. Where is it?" Nancy looked around once more before approaching and whispering in George's ear. He listened carefully to the directions and immediately stood up. "Thank you," he said, already taking his wallet out of his pocket. But Nancy backed away. "I don't want money. Just promise you'll take care of her. Michelle deserves a chance to be someone in life." George nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. Following Nancy's instructions, George and the investigator arrived at an abandoned building a few blocks away. It was an old textile factory, closed for years. The place was partially demolished, with exposed beams and peeling walls. "Is she here?" asked the investigator, illuminating the entrance with a flashlight. "Nancy said that on the 3rd floor there's a room that's still intact. Michelle discovered that you could climb up the fire escape." They found the metal ladder, partially rusted. George began to climb, ignoring the investigator's protests about the danger. Each step creaked under his weight, but he didn't care. He could only think of Michelle, alone and scared. Arriving on the 3rd floor, they saw a faint light coming from one of the rooms. George cautiously approached and peeked through the broken door. His heart almost stopped. Michelle was there, huddled in a corner, hugging a book. A small flashlight illuminated the pages, and even in that desperate situation, she was reading. Her face was dirty with tears and dust, and there was a cut on her forehead, probably from the fall through the library window. "Michelle," he called softly. She looked up, startled, ready to run, but upon recognizing him, her face contorted in a mixture of relief and fear. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't want to run away, but he was there and I got so scared." George ran to her and hugged her. For the first time since he had met her, Michelle cried openly, sobbing against his chest. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking her hair. "You're safe now." "I'm not," she said between sobs. "He found me. He'll find me again. And now he knows you have money. We're going to solve this," George assured her. "Together." That's when he noticed the book she was holding. It wasn't one of the books from the library, but an old notebook, very similar to the one Mrs. Thompson had given him. "What is this?" he asked. Michelle looked at the notebook and then at George, hesitant. "It's Mom's diary, the other diary. She kept one here and another at the library. She said it was important to keep them separate in case he found one of them. George took the other diary from the inside pocket of his jacket, where he had kept it to protect it from the rain. "Mrs. Thompson gave me this one today," he said. "Do you know what's written in them?" Michelle shook her head. "Mom said it was only to be read when I was older, that there were things I couldn't understand yet, but—" She stopped, biting her lip. "But what?" "But she also said that if something happened to her, I was to look in the diaries, that there was important information that could protect me from Tony." George looked at the two notebooks. What had Irene written that was so important that it needed to be kept secret? What kind of information could protect Michelle? Before he could ask more, they heard a noise coming from the fire escape. The investigator, who was standing guard at the door, immediately drew his flashlight. "Someone is coming up," he whispered. George hugged Michelle tighter, feeling her tremble in his arms. The steps on the metal ladder were getting louder, closer. "Is there another way out?" he asked urgently. Michelle pointed to a door at the back of the room. "You can go through the roof of the next building. I've done it before, but it's too dangerous for an adult," completed George, understanding the dilemma. The steps were almost reaching the 3rd floor. They could hear voices now. More than one person was coming up. "Mr. Halston," called the investigator in a low voice. "We need to decide now. If it's him—" George looked at Michelle, at the diaries, at the back door. They had seconds to make a decision that could change everything. That's when they heard the voice, that hoarse and cruel voice that had terrorized Michelle for so long. "I know you're up there, Princess," echoed Tony's voice up the ladder. "And this time there's no little window to escape through." George felt Michelle squeeze his hand tightly. He looked at the two diaries in his hands, then at the back door, and made his decision. What he didn't know was that this decision would trigger a series of events that would forever change not only his life and Michelle's, but also reveal secrets that Irene had kept until her last breath. George acted quickly. He handed the two diaries to the investigator and whispered precise instructions in his ear. The man nodded, understanding the plan without needing more explanations. With silent movements, he headed for the back door, disappearing into the shadows with the precious notebooks. "Michelle," whispered George, kneeling to be at her height, "I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" The girl nodded, although her eyes were wide with fear. The steps on the fire escape were getting closer and closer, and now they could hear more than one voice talking in a low tone. "Princess!" Tony's voice echoed again, closer. "There's no need to be afraid. Daddy just wants to talk to your new rich friend." George took off his jacket and put it over Michelle's shoulders. It was too big for her, but it would serve for what he had in mind. From his pants pocket, he took out his cell phone and handed it to her. "When I say now, you're going to press this button," he explained, showing a number on speed dial. "It's my lawyer's number. He's already waiting for your call, understand?" Michelle held the cell phone tightly, nodding again. George could feel her small body trembling, but there was a determination in her eyes that impressed him. The steps stopped on the landing of the 3rd floor. George positioned himself in front of Michelle, protecting her with his body. The light of flashlights invaded the room, and then they appeared. Tony was accompanied by two men. One was tall and thin, with an angular face and acne scars. The other was shorter and stockier, with a mermaid tattoo on his neck. Both looked as threatening as Tony. "Well, well," said Tony, his cruel smile illuminated by the flashlights. "What a touching scene! The millionaire and the little genius. It even looks like a movie story." George maintained his firm posture. Years of difficult negotiations had prepared him to remain calm, even in the most tense situations. "Your friends seem expensive, Tony," he commented, his voice controlled. "I imagine how much you're spending to maintain this small extortion operation." Tony's smile faltered for a moment. "Don't come at me with that businessman talk. You have something that belongs to me." "Michelle is not a property," replied George, feeling the girl shrink behind him. "And technically, at this moment, you are committing several crimes." The tall man took a step forward, but Tony stopped him with a gesture. "Crimes," he laughed. "The only crime here is you having kidnapped my daughter. I have the birth certificate. Remember, I can destroy your reputation with a single call to the newspapers." George allowed himself a small smile. "Interesting you mentioned documents. You know, while you were busy gathering your associates, I had a few hours to make some calls." Tony frowned, clearly not expecting this reaction. "I discovered interesting things," continued George. "For example, that you have 3 outstanding arrest warrants in different states, that you use at least 5 different identities, and that the birth certificate you mentioned so much, it was falsified." Tony's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. "You're bluffing." "I'm a very rich man, Tony. You know what that means? That I have connections, that I can discover things that ordinary police can't. For example, I know that you owe money to dangerous people, a lot of money." The 2 men accompanying Tony looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. "That's why you're here, isn't it?" continued George. "It's not for Michelle, it never was. You found out that she was being helped by someone with money, and you saw an opportunity to resolve your debts." "Shut up!" shouted Tony, taking a step forward. "You don't know anything." "I know more than you imagine," replied George, his voice still calm. "For example, I know your friends here haven't been paid yet, that you promised a percentage of what you were going to get from me. Am I right?" The man with the mermaid tattoo shifted, uneasy. Tony glared at him. "Now," said George. Behind him, Michelle pressed the button on the cell phone. Seconds later, sirens began to sound in the distance. "What did you do?" snarled Tony, advancing menacingly. "Nothing much," replied George. "I just activated the police who were waiting for my signal blocks away. Oh, and there's also a news crew arriving, the same one you threatened to contact." The sirens were closer now. The tall man cursed and began to back away towards the ladder. "You're not going anywhere," shouted Tony, but his companion was already running down the stairs. The man with the tattoo hesitated for a moment, looking between Tony and the exit. "He doesn't have the money he promised," said George. "He never did, but the police would love to ask some questions about your other jobs." It was enough. The second man also fled, leaving Tony alone. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now trembling. "You can't do this to me. They'll kill me if I don't pay." "Then maybe you should have thought better before getting involved with them," replied George, "or before terrorizing an innocent child." The sirens were very close now. Red and blue. Lights began to illuminate the broken windows of the building. Tony looked around like a cornered animal. For a moment, George thought he was going to attack, but then something in his face changed. The fear gave way to an expression that George knew well. The expression of someone about to do something desperate. "She's not as innocent as you think," said Tony, backing away towards the ladder. "Why do you think Irene kept those diaries? Why do you think she ran so much? Ask your little genius about her real father, about who he really was." Before George could respond, Tony disappeared down the ladder. Seconds later, they heard the sound of hurried footsteps descending. George turned to Michelle, who was pale and trembling. "It's okay," he said, hugging her. "It's over." But something in her face made him stop. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but there was something more. Something that looked a lot like guilt. "Michelle," he called softly. "What did he mean about your real father?" The girl hugged George's jacket tighter around her small shoulders. Tears began to stream down her dirty face. I don't know," she whispered. "Mom never told me. She only said he was a good man, who had died before I was born. But sometimes, when she thought I was sleeping, I heard her crying and asking him for forgiveness. Heavy footsteps began to climb the stairs. The police were arriving, but George could barely hear. He was remembering Mrs. Thompson's words about the diary, about how important it was that he read it. "Let's go home," he said finally. "We have a lot to talk about." As they descended the stairs, now accompanied by police officers, George couldn't stop thinking about Tony's last words. What would be the secret so big that Irene had kept in her diaries, and why did he have the impression that the answer would change not only Michelle's life, but his as well? The return to the Halston mansion was silent. George watched Michelle in the rearview mirror. She was huddled in the back seat, still wrapped in his oversized jacket, staring blankly out the window. The cut on her forehead had been cleaned and bandaged by the paramedics, but her face still carried the marks of fear and exhaustion. Upon arriving, they found Mrs. Thompson waiting at the door. The librarian had insisted on coming, worried about Michelle's emotional state. As soon as they entered, she wrapped the girl in a tight hug. "My little one," whispered the lady, her voice choked. "What a scare you gave us." Michelle allowed herself to be hugged, but her eyes sought the diaries that the investigator had brought separately. The two notebooks were on the coffee table in the living room, seemingly harmless, but carrying secrets that now weighed on all of them. "I think we need to read," said Michelle finally, her voice small but determined. George exchanged a look with Mrs. Thompson. The librarian nodded slightly. "Are you sure?" he asked Michelle. "We can wait until tomorrow. You've been through a lot today." Michelle shook her head. "Mum always said that the truth hurts less than doubt." She sat on the sofa, and George noticed how she looked even smaller in that luxurious environment. Mrs. Thompson sat next to her, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. George took the first diary, the one that had been kept at the library. The first page was dated 8 years ago. "Do you want me to read aloud?" he asked. Michelle nodded, squeezing Mrs. Thompson's hand. George took a deep breath and began, "My dear Michelle, if you are reading this, it is because something has happened to me. There are so many things I needed to tell you, so many truths I have kept waiting for you to be old enough to understand. But life doesn't always give us the time we need. I start this story on the day I met your real father. Not Tony. He was never your father, despite what the birth certificate says. Your father was a good, honest, brilliant man, someone who loved knowledge as much as you." George stopped reading abruptly. His hands began to tremble. "What is it?" asked Michelle, anxious. "Why did you stop?" But George was looking at the date on the next page, at the name that was written there, at the details that were beginning to fit into his mind like pieces of a terrible puzzle. "It can't be," he murmured. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, concerned. "What is it, Mr. Halston?" George looked at Michelle, really looked at her for the first time since he had met her. Her eyes, which had intrigued him so much, her love for books, her facility with numbers and sciences, the way something in her had touched his heart from the first moment. "Your father," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "His name was Richard Halston, my brother." The silence that followed was deafening. Michelle looked at him with wide eyes, trying to process what she had just heard. But Mum said my father had died," she stammered. "He did," replied George, the tears now running freely down his face. "In a car accident, 8 years ago." With trembling hands, he continued to read. "I met Richard at the university library. I worked there part-time while I was taking my literature course. He was doing a doctorate in theoretical physics. He was brilliant, kind, and had the most beautiful smile I have ever seen. We fell in love among the shelves of books, between discussions about the universe and poems. He showed me that knowledge was more than power. It was freedom. It was the key to a bigger world. When I found out I was pregnant, Richard was radiant. He already had plans to teach quantum physics to the baby still in my belly. But then George stopped again, his voice failing. He knew the next part of the story. He had lived it. "The accident," whispered Michelle. George nodded. Richard was returning from a conference. It was a rainy night. The car skidded on a curve. He closed his eyes, the memories of that night coming back in full force. The phone call in the middle of the night, the rush to the hospital, the doctor with a grave expression saying there was nothing to be done. "But why didn't Mom ever tell me?" asked Michelle. Her voice choked. "Why didn't she ever look for you?" George went back to reading the diary, looking for answers. When Richard died, I discovered that his family was one of the richest in New York. He had never mentioned it. It wasn't the kind of thing that mattered to him. "I thought about looking for you, about telling you about the baby, but then I saw in the newspapers that his brother, George, had taken over the family business. I saw how he changed after Richard's death, how he closed himself off to the world. I was afraid that they would think I was an opportunist, afraid they would take you away from me, so I ran. I changed cities. I promised myself that one day I would tell you the truth when you were older, when you could understand. But then Tony appeared," continued Michelle, the pieces fitting together in her mind. "And Mom needed help." George continued reading. "Tony seemed like a savior at first. He offered help, protection. He said he could register the baby as his daughter, give her a name. I was alone, scared, desperately needing help. I accepted. It was the biggest mistake of my life." The rest of the story they already knew. How Tony revealed himself to be violent, how he started drinking, hitting, threatening. How Irene finally fled with Michelle, returning to New York, where she thought she would be safe. "I kept these diaries," finished Irene's letter, "because I know that one day you will need to know the truth. You will need to understand who you really are. You are the daughter of Richard Halston, my dear. You inherited from him not only the brilliant intelligence, but also the generous heart. Never forget that." George closed the diary slowly. He looked at Michelle, his niece, the daughter of his brother, the last connection he had with Richard. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm so sorry for not having been there, for not having looked more, for not having—" But he couldn't finish. Michelle had gotten up and, for the first time, hugged him of her own accord. It was an awkward hug, full of tears and sobs, but also full of something more. Hope. "I have a family," she whispered against his chest. "Yes," he replied, hugging her tightly, "and I promise you'll never be alone again." Mrs. Thompson watched the scene with tears in her eyes. But then her gaze fell on the second diary, the one Michelle had kept in the abandoned factory. "There's a more," she said softly. "I think we need to read the other one too." George and Michelle separated, looking at the second notebook. What else could Irene have written? What other secrets still needed to be revealed? George took the second diary with trembling hands. Something told him that the story was far from over. The second diary had a different look from the first. If that one seemed to have been written with calm and purpose, this one showed signs of haste and despair. The pages were crumpled, some stained with tears, Irene's handwriting much less careful. George opened to the first page, feeling Michelle huddled closer to him on the sofa. Mrs. Thompson remained seated on the other side of the girl, like a silent guardian. "This diary is different," he began to read. "It's not a letter to you, my Michelle, but a record of what I discovered, of why we need to keep running, of what really happened that rainy night." George felt his heart race. The night that Irene mentioned could only be that of the accident that killed his brother. "Tony found out who your real father was," continued the diary. "He found the papers I kept, old photos, documents. That's when everything changed. When he started drinking more, getting more violent, he researched the Halstons, found out about the family fortune. That's when I realized that he had never helped me out of kindness. He was always looking for an opportunity. But what does this have to do with the accident? Asked Michelle in a low voice. George continued reading, his voice trembling slightly. Yesterday, Tony came home drunk, more agitated than usual. He started yelling, breaking things. He said he knew everything, that on the night of the accident, Richard wasn't alone in the car. George's breath failed. That was a part of the story that he had never fully discovered. There was another car, he continued to read. A car that followed Richard after the conference. Tony knew the driver, a man who did dirty jobs for money. The same man who, days before the accident, had received a large sum in his bank account. No, whispered George, the reality of what he was reading beginning to hit him. It can't be. But Irene's words continued, relentless. The accident wasn't an accident. The other car forced Richard off the road. Tony said it was a clean job. No one ever suspected. But he kept that information, waiting for the right moment to use it. Michelle grabbed George's hand tightly. He could feel that she was trembling. "Why would someone want to hurt my father?" she asked, her voice small and scared. George closed, his eyes, old memories returning like painful flashes. The conference where Richard had been that night wasn't a simple academic lecture. He was going to present an important discovery. Something related to a new method of data processing that could revolutionize the technology industry. "Keep reading," asked Mrs. Thompson softly, noticing his hesitation. George took a deep breath and returned to the diary. Tony was too drunk, talking too much. He said that the man who caused the accident worked for a company that was a rival of the Halstons, that Richard needed to be silenced before presenting his discovery, that there were millions at stake. "Transcorp," murmured George, remembering suddenly. "They were our biggest competitors at the time. They were developing a system similar to what Richard had created, but he was years ahead." His hands began to tremble so much that he could barely hold the diary. Mrs. Thompson gently took it from him and continued to read. But the worst thing wasn't that. Tony said that after Richard died, someone from the Halston family sought out the man who caused the accident, paid him to disappear, to bury the story, said it was better for everyone to think it was just a tragedy, an accident on a rainy night. "No!" shouted George, standing up abruptly. "That's a lie! None of us, and we never—" But then an old memory hit him like a punch. His father, a few days after the accident, locked in his office with a man he had never seen before. The way he had insisted that they not investigate the accident too much, that they accept the official version of the police. "Your grandfather," he said to Michelle, his voice breaking. "My father. He must have discovered the truth. He must have thought he was protecting the company, the family." Michelle shrank on the sofa, silent tears running down her face. Mrs. Thompson continued reading. "That's why we need to keep running. Tony said he will use this information, that he will blackmail the Halstons, that he will tell the press, destroy the reputation of the family, unless we pay, and we continue paying. That's why he was so confident," said George, the understanding hitting him. "That's why he wasn't afraid to threaten me. He knew he had something much bigger to use against our family." "But why didn't Mum tell this before?" asked Michelle. "Why did she keep this secret for so long?" Mrs. Thompson turned the page and read the answer. "I can't tell this to anyone, not even to you yet, my daughter. Not only for our safety, but because I know how much you love knowledge, how much you believe in the search for truth. And I'm afraid that knowing that your father died because of that, for wanting to share a discovery with the world, may make you lose that faith, that love for knowledge that you inherited from him." George sat back down, feeling the weight of all these revelations. His brother hadn't died by chance. He had been murdered. And his own father had helped to cover up the truth. "What do we do now?" asked Michelle, her voice small but determined. George looked at his niece, at the daughter of his brother, at the girl who, even after everything she had gone through, still clutched a physics book against her chest as if it were her most precious possession. "Now," he said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he still had, "we're going to do what your father would have done. We're going to seek the truth, no matter how much it hurts." But when Mrs. Thompson closed the second diary, something fell from between its pages. It was a small, sealed envelope with a single word written on the front: evidence. George's heart stopped for a moment. What else had Irene discovered? What other revelations still awaited them? With trembling hands, George picked up the envelope that had fallen from the diary. It was thin, but he could feel that there was something inside, possibly papers or photographs. He looked at Michelle, who watched the envelope with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Do you want me to open it?" he asked softly. The girl nodded, squeezing the physics book she still held tighter. Mrs. Thompson placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. George opened the envelope carefully. Inside were 3 items: an old photograph, a yellowed newspaper clipping, and a folded paper that appeared to be a copy of a bank statement. The photograph showed Richard, his brother, in front of the university where he taught. He was smiling, that genuine and bright smile that George remembered so well. Next to him was a young woman whom he recognized as Irene, also smiling, one hand resting discreetly on her belly that was barely beginning to show signs of pregnancy. "That's Mom," whispered Michelle, touching the photo with her fingertips. "She looked so happy." "She was," replied George, feeling a lump in his throat. "Your father had that effect on people. He made everyone around him feel special, important." He placed the photo carefully on the table and picked up the newspaper clipping. It was a small note, almost hidden among other larger news, dated a few days after the accident. "Prestigious professor dies in car accident. Dr. Richard Halston, 35, renowned researcher in the area of quantum. Data processing, died last night after his car ran off the road in the Appalachian Mountains. The professor was returning from a conference where he would present his latest discovery in the area of quantum computing. Police are investigating the causes of the accident, but suspect that heavy rain may have been a determining factor." "But it wasn't the rain," said Michelle, her voice carrying a maturity beyond her years. "It was that other car, the man who was paid to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. George quickly unfolded the last paper, the bank statement. It was from an account in the name of someone called Robert Mendez, a person he had never heard of. But one transaction in particular caught his attention, a deposit of considerable value made 3 days before the accident, coming from a shell company that, after a more detailed analysis, George recognized as a subsidiary of Transcorp. "Ah, that must be the man," he said, feeling his blood boil. "The one Tony mentioned, the one who was paid to kill my father," completed Michelle, her voice surprisingly firm. "Because he was going to tell everyone about his discovery." George looked at his niece with admiration and concern. How could a 6-year-old child demonstrate such strength in the face of such terrible revelations? "There's one more thing," said Mrs. Thompson, who had picked up the envelope and was examining it against the light. "There's something still inside." She turned the envelope over, and a small folded piece of paper fell out. It was a note, handwritten by Irene. "If something happens to me, look for Mary Anderson at Transcorp. She was secretary to the president of the company at the time of the accident. She was the one who contacted me a few months ago, wanting to clear her conscience. She was the one who gave me this evidence. She knows more, much more, but she's scared. She said she will only speak if it's really necessary, if something happens to me." George felt his heart race. A witness, someone who could confirm everything. who could finally bring the truth to light. "We need to find this woman," he said, already getting up. But Michelle held him by the hand. "Wait, there's one more thing we need to know first." George looked at her, confused. "What did Transcorp want to hide so much?" she asked. "What was my father's discovery? Why was it so important that they did this to him?" George sat back down, realizing that he owed her that explanation. "Your father," he began, choosing his words carefully, "was working on something revolutionary, a method of data processing that could change everything: computers, internet, communications. It was so advanced that many thought it impossible." "How did it work?" asked Michelle, her eyes shining with that same curiosity that George had so often seen in Richard's eyes. "The technical part I never fully understood," he admitted. "Richard tried to explain it to me, but it was too complex. Something about using principles of quantum physics to process information in a completely new way. The important thing is that if it worked, it would make all the technology that existed at the time obsolete. And Transcorp had invested billions in the old model. So they killed him," said Michelle, "not only to prevent him from revealing the discovery, but to steal his research." George nodded sadly. "Probably. But your father was brilliant and careful. He kept crucial parts of the research only in his mind. After the accident, no one was able to completely reproduce what he had developed." Michelle was silent for a moment, processing everything she had discovered. Then, to everyone's surprise, she opened the physics book she was holding and took out a folded piece of paper from inside it. "I think you need to see this," she said. "I found it among Mom's things, but I never understood what it was. Until now." George took the paper carefully. It was a page covered with complex equations and diagrams, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. At the top of the page, a date: 3 days before the accident. "My God," he whispered, recognizing some symbols. "This is part of his research," completed Michelle. "Mom must have kept it without knowing what it was, but I think I understand some parts." George looked at her, astonished. "How so?" "It's similar to what I was reading in the quantum physics book," she explained, "about superposition of states and entanglement. Dad was using that to create a new kind of computer, wasn't he?" Pride and pain mixed in George's chest. His niece had not only inherited Richard's intelligence, she had inherited his passion for unraveling the mysteries of the universe. But before he could answer, they heard a noise coming from the entrance of the mansion. Heavy footsteps and altered voices. George jumped to his feet, instinctively placing himself in front of Michelle. Mrs. Thompson grabbed the diaries and papers, quickly hiding them in her bag. The living room door opened violently, and 3 men in suits entered. George immediately recognized the one in the middle. It was Martin Anderson, the current president of Transcorp. "Good evening, George," he said with a cold smile. "I think we need to talk about some family matters." The silence that followed Martin Anderson's entrance was heavy, almost suffocating. George remained standing, protecting Michelle with his body, while Mrs. Thompson discreetly stored the last documents in her bag. "How did you get in here?" asked George, his voice controlled despite the evident tension. Martin smiled, that cold and calculated smile that George knew well from business meetings. "Your security system is very good, George, but some of your employees are more receptive to certain forms of persuasion." George felt his blood boil as he realized that someone on his team had been bribed, but he maintained his composure. Years of difficult negotiations had taught him not to show weakness. "What do you want?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. Martin took a few steps around the room, observing the expensive objects with false interest. "We've heard that you're investigating certain events of the past, events that would be better left forgotten, like the death of my brother," shot George, his voice laden with bitterness. Martin's smile faltered for a moment. Accidents are terrible tragedies, George, especially on rainy nights, on dangerous roads. It wasn't an accident. Michelle's voice sounded clear and firm, surprising everyone. She had taken a step to the side, coming out from behind George. You had him killed. Martin looked at the girl as if he was noticing her for the first time. His eyes narrowed dangerously. So this is the famous niece, he said, his tone now more threatening. Richard's daughter. They say she inherited his intelligence and apparently also his tendency to meddle where she shouldn't. Don't you dare talk about her, growled George, pulling Michelle back behind him. Or what? Replied Martin, his smile returning. Are you going to sue me, report me to the police? With what evidence? He gestured, and the two men accompanying him began to move around the room, clearly looking for something. We know that Irene left diaries, continued Martin, that she had compromising documents. Tony told us everything. It was the first thing he did when he realized he was cornered. George felt his heart clench. So that was it. Tony had sought out Transcorp, probably offering the information in exchange for protection. We have nothing, he lied, and even if we did, there are copies in safe places. It was a bluff, but it seemed to work. Martin hesitated for a moment. You know, George, he said, changing tactics, we don't need to be enemies. Transcorp and Halston Enterprises could be great partners. We could bury the past, look to the future. Like you buried my father. Michelle's voice trembled with anger. Martin ignored her, continuing, Think carefully, George. Your company is going through difficulties. The market is changing. A merger with Transcorp could be the solution to all your problems. In exchange for our silence, completed George, the disgust evident in his voice. In exchange for peace, corrected Martin softly, for all of us, including your lovely niece. The veiled threat made George take a step forward, but Mrs. Thompson stopped him with a touch on his arm. By the way, continued Martin, speaking of peace, you must be wondering about Mary Anderson, our former secretary. She also chose the path of peace. She decided to retire in a beautiful house in the countryside, far away from all this mess. George felt Michelle tremble beside him. Another witness silenced. And what about Robert Mendez? Asked George, trying to buy time while his mind worked on a plan. The man you paid to kill my brother. Did he also choose the path of peace? For the first time, Martin seemed genuinely surprised. So you know about him. We know much more than you imagine, replied George. For example, we know about the bank transfers, about the shell company you used, about how your former president panicked when he found out that Richard was going to present his discovery. Martin narrowed his eyes. Be careful, George, you're entering dangerous territory. No, replied George, his voice now firmer. You're the ones who entered dangerous territory when you decided to kill my brother, when you tried to steal his research, when you thought you could bury the truth for always. It was then that something unexpected happened. Michelle stepped forward, holding her physics book like a shield. My father's research, she said, her voice small but clear. You never managed to make it work, did you? That's why you're here. It's not just for the diaries. You want to know if he left anything else, if I inherited more than just his intelligence. Martin looked at her with a mixture of surprise and irritation. That's absurd. A 6-year-old child couldn't... Quantum superposition, interrupted Michelle. Entanglement. Parallel processing on a subatomic scale. That's what my father was developing, wasn't he? A way to use the properties of quantum physics to create a new kind of computer. One that could process information in a way that no one thought possible. Martin's face paled visibly. The two men accompanying him stopped their search, looking at the girl in astonishment. How do you... Izan, began Martin, but Michelle continued. It's all here, she said, opening the physics book. Not in the technical details, of course, But the basic principles, the theory behind everything, it's the same one I'm studying, the same one my father used. Only he discovered how to apply it in a way that no one had thought of before. George looked at his niece with a mixture of pride and concern. She wasn't just defending herself, she was openly challenging the people who had killed her. "Father." Martin seemed to have momentarily lost his composure. "That's ridiculous. You're just a child. A child who understands things that your scientists have taken years to comprehend," replied Michelle. "And you know what else I understand? That you're scared, afraid that I can finish what my father started." The silence that followed was deafening. Martin looked at Michelle as if she was a bomb about to explode. The two men accompanying him seemed equally disturbed. That's when they heard sirens in the distance. "What is that?" asked Martin, his voice betraying a touch of panic. George allowed himself a small smile. "Oh, I forgot to mention. I installed a new security system after the incident with Tony. Silent, discreet, and connected directly to the police." The sirens were closer now. "You wouldn't do that," said Martin, his mask of calm finally breaking. "You can't prove anything." "No?" replied George. "Then why are you so worried? Why did you break into my house in the middle of the night? Why are you so interested in Irene's diaries?" Martin made a brusque gesture to his men and began to back away towards the door. "This isn't over, George," he threatened. "You have no idea what you're facing." "No," replied George, hugging Michelle protectively. "You're the one who has no idea what you're facing, because now it's personal." When Martin and his men hurriedly left the mansion, George finally released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The sirens were very close now. His bluff had worked. But when he looked at Michelle, he saw that she was smiling. "What is it?" he asked, intrigued by her reaction after such a tense moment. "They took the bait," she replied, her eyes shining with that same intelligence she had inherited from Richard. "Now we know they're desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." George looked at his niece with a mixture of admiration and concern. She wasn't just facing her fears, she was several steps ahead, planning, calculating. But as the sirens finally fell silent outside, he couldn't help but wonder, what price would Michelle pay for being as brilliant as her father? And more importantly, how could he protect her from the same fate? The night that followed Martin Anderson's visit was long and tense. George reinforced the security of the mansion, discovering that one of the night guards had been bribed. The next man confessed, crying that he had received a considerable sum to take a break on that specific night. Michelle couldn't sleep. George found her in the library at 3 a.m, surrounded by physics books and notes made with her childish but surprisingly organized handwriting. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" he asked softly, sitting next to her. "I can't sleep," she replied without taking her eyes off the notes. "I'm trying to understand more about my father's work, about what he was developing." George looked at the scattered papers. There were complex diagrams, equations that he barely understood, and at the center of everything, the page with Richard's original notes. "Do you really understand this?" he asked, still impressed by his niece's intellectual capacity. Michelle finally looked up. There were dark circles under her eyes, but also a fierce determination that reminded so much of Richard that it hurt. "Not everything," she admitted. "Some parts are very advanced. But the basic idea, yes, I understand. And the more I study, the more I realize why they were so afraid of what Dad discovered." George picked up one of her notes. Even with her childish handwriting, the concepts described there were too advanced for someone her age. "Martin Anderson was really scared when you started talking about the research," he commented. "Because they never managed to make it work," replied Michelle. "Even after stealing part of Dad's notes after the accident, something was missing, something he kept only in his head." She picked up the physics book that she always carried with her and took out another sheet of paper from inside it. "I found this hidden inside the cover of Mom's diary," she said. "I don't think even she knew it was there." George took the paper carefully. It was another page of Richard's notes, but this one seemed different. There were not only formulas and diagrams, but also small, personal notes in the margins. "For Michelle," he read aloud one of those notes. "When you are old enough to understand, this will be yours. Because I know that you will inherit not only my genes, but my passion for unraveling the mysteries of the universe." Michelle had tears in her eyes. He knew. Even before I was born, he knew I was going to be like him. George hugged his niece, feeling her small body tremble with suppressed sobs. "There's one more thing," she said after calming down a little. "Something I discovered studying these notes. Something that I don't think even Transcorp knows yet." She took one of her notebooks and showed a series of calculations. Dad's discovery wasn't just about quantum computing. It was about something much bigger. He found a way to use quantum entanglement to transfer information instantly, no matter the distance. George frowned. "How so?" "It's like you could send a message from Brazil to Japan without needing cables, satellites, or anything physical. The information simply appears there instantly. It's something that physicists thought was impossible." "And that would be so valuable?" Michelle looked at him with a seriousness beyond her years. "Uncle George, that would change everything. Communications, internet, data transfer. It would be a revolution bigger than the internet itself. And Transcorp, they have billions invested in the current technology, in undersea cables, satellites, infrastructure. That would become obsolete," completed George, finally understanding the dimension of what his brother had discovered. "But there's a problem," continued Michelle. "To make this work, you need a special kind of material. Something that Dad describes in the notes, but that didn't exist at the time. He theorized how to create it, but she was interrupted by a noise coming from the garden." George immediately stood up, placing himself between Michelle and the window. "It must be just the wind," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. George approached the window cautiously. The garden was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight. For a moment, he saw nothing abnormal. Then a movement caught his attention. A figure was moving among the shadows of the trees. It didn't seem to be one of the security guards. It moved stealthily, as if it didn't want to be seen. "Stay here," he whispered to Michelle. "I'm going to alert security." But before he could reach the phone, the library door opened. George turned, expecting to see one of the guards, but who entered was a middle-aged woman with grey hair and a frightened expression. "Mary Anderson?" he asked, recognizing the former secretary of Transcorp from Irene's description. The woman nodded nervously. "I'm sorry for entering like this, but I needed to talk to you, and I couldn't be seen entering through the front door." "How did you get in?" asked George, still suspicious. "I know this house," she replied. "I used to come here to the meetings with your father. When he—" She stopped, looking at Michelle with an expression of guilt. "When he decided to cover everything up." Michelle approached the woman, her eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You knew," she said. "You knew what they did to my father." Mary Anderson nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I knew, and I've lived with that guilt for years, but now they're planning to do it again." George felt his blood run cold. "How so?" The woman took an envelope from her bag with trembling hands. "Martin Anderson, he discovered that you have Richard's original notes, that the girl can understand part of them. He's not going to let that happen again. He already tried to scare us today," said George. "It didn't work." Mary Anderson shook her head sadly. "It's not just that. They discovered something in Richard's old notes about the special material he needed to make the quantum transfer work." Michelle took a step forward. The material that didn't exist at the time? Yes, replied Mary Anderson. Now it exists. A company in South Korea managed to synthesize something similar a few months ago. Transcorp is trying to buy the patent and erase any connection to Richard's original research. She opened the envelope and spread several documents on the table. They were emails, internal memos, technical reports. They're going to try to steal credit for the discovery, she continued, present it as if it was something totally new, developed by them, and anyone who can prove otherwise. She didn't complete the sentence, but she didn't need to. Richard's fate was proof enough of what Transcorp was capable of doing to protect its interests. George looked at Michelle, expecting to find her scared, but instead he saw in her eyes that same determined glint that Richard had when he was about to make an important discovery. They don't know one thing, she said, picking up her notebook. Dad didn't need that specific material. He had found another way. Mary Anderson looked at her in astonishment. How so? Michelle opened her notebook to a specific page, showing a series of calculations she had made. In his notes, in the margins, there are small clues. He knew that this material would be difficult to create, so he developed an alternative, something that could be done with the technology of the time. It's all here, hidden in simple mathematical codes, so simple that no one at Transcorp thought to look for them. George felt his heart race. His niece had not only inherited Richard's intelligence, she had inherited his ability to see beyond the obvious, to find solutions where no one else looked. But before they could discuss more, they heard another noise, this time coming from the hallway. And from the panicked expression on Mary Anderson's face, it wasn't just the wind. The night was far from over, and the secrets that still needed to be revealed could change not only their lives, but the future of technology as they knew it. George reacted quickly to hearing the footsteps in the hallway. In seconds, he turned off the lights in the library and guided Michelle and Mary Anderson behind one of the large bookcases. The hearts of the three beat fast as they watched the door through the gaps between the books. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door opened silently. A figure entered. It was one of the men who had accompanied Martin Anderson earlier. He was holding something in his hand that even in the dim light, George recognized as a small camera. "They're here," whispered the man to someone in the hallway. "The notes, exactly where he said they would be." Martin Anderson entered soon, after his normally composed face now marked by an expression of cruel triumph. "Great," he said, approaching the table where Michelle had left her notebooks. "Photograph everything. Every page, every note. We need to find out how much the girl really understood." The man began to methodically photograph Michelle's notes. George felt his niece tremble beside him, but when he looked at her, he saw that it wasn't from fear. Her eyes shone with something that seemed almost amusement. "Mr. Anderson," called the man, his voice betraying some confusion. "There's something strange here." Martin approached to see what he was pointing at. "What is it?" "These equations. They don't make sense. It's like they were written by a child playing scientist," completed Martin with disdain. "No," replied the man, now clearly disturbed. "It's like they're purposefully wrong, as if someone wanted us to think that she doesn't understand, when in reality..." He didn't complete the sentence. George felt Michelle hold his hand and squeeze 3 times, a code they had developed earlier when they planned this possibility. 3 squeezes meant they took the bait. "Let me see that," said Martin, grabbing one of the notebooks. His eyes raced across the pages, his expression shifting from triumph to worry. "This can't wait. Where's the original page? The one with Richard's notes?" "Udi," the man searched among the scattered papers but couldn't find it. "It's not here, sir." "Look properly," Martin growled. "It has to be here somewhere. That little brat was studying it just hours ago." "Looking for this?" A voice echoed from the library doorway. Everyone turned. Mrs. Thompson stood at the entrance, holding the original page of Richard's notes. Beside her was George's private investigator, and behind them several police officers with guns drawn. "How?" Martin began, but his voice trailed off as he saw more people entering the library. It was a full news crew, with cameras rolling live. A reporter known for her investigations into corporate corruption stood among them, microphone in hand. "Good evening, viewers," she began. "We're broadcasting live from the Halston mansion, where we've just caught Transcorp executives breaking into the property in search of documents related to the murder of Professor Richard Halston, which occurred 8 years ago." "This is outrageous!" Martin shouted, his face now red with anger. "You have no proof of anything." "Don't we?" George asked, stepping out from behind the bookshelf with Michelle and Mary Anderson. "How about we start with the security cameras that recorded your entire previous visit today, or the documents Mary Anderson has been keeping safe all these years? Or better yet, how about the recorded confessions from the man you paid to kill my brother?" Martin visibly paled. "Robert Mendez is dead." "Is he?" Michelle asked, her voice small but clear. "Are you sure about that?" As if answering her. A question. An older man walked into the library. His face was etched with scars and years of guilt, but his eyes were steady as they met Martin's. "Hello, Martin," said Robert Mendez. "Long time no see, isn't it? 8 years, to be precise." Martin staggered backward, leaning on the table. "No, it's not possible. We paid. We were guaranteed that I was dead?" Robert finished. "Yes, you paid very well for it. But you know how it is. Some people have more conscience than money, like Mary Anderson here, who found me months ago and convinced me to do the right thing." The reporter stepped forward with the microphone. "Mr. Mendez, do you confirm that you were hired by Transcorp to cause the accident that killed Professor Richard Halston?" "I confirm," he replied, his voice filled with regret. "I have all the evidence, bank transfers, coded emails, even recordings of conversations with Martin Anderson and other executives." The police officers began to approach Martin and his accomplice, who now seemed to have aged years in a few minutes. "That's not all," said Michelle, surprising everyone. She approached the table and picked up her notebooks. "Those notes you photographed? They're fake. I made them specifically for you to find." "What?" Martin asked, his voice barely audible. "A trap," she explained. "We knew you'd come after the notes, that you wouldn't resist the temptation. So I prepared a special version with obvious errors for anyone who actually understands the subject. Errors that would prove you were specifically looking for my father's work." George couldn't contain a proud smile. His niece had not only predicted Transcorp's movements, she had used their own greed against them. "The real notes," Michelle continued, "are already safe. And not only that, I understood them. I understood what my father discovered, how he planned to make it work. And unlike him, I won't keep it a secret." She turned to the reporter. "My father wanted this knowledge to be for everyone, to be used to help people, not to make a few companies even richer. And that's what's going to happen now." The live broadcast captured every moment. Millions of viewers watched as the truth about one of the biggest corporate crimes in the country was finally revealed. And at the center of it all, a 6-year-old girl who had inherited not only her father's genius, but also his integrity. "George Halston," one of the police officers called out, "we need your formal statement, and the girl's too, if she's willing." George looked at Michelle, who nodded bravely. "We're ready," he replied. "We've waited too long for justice." As Martin Anderson and his accomplice were led away in handcuffs and the news crew continued their live broadcast, George couldn't help but think of Richard, of how proud his brother would be of his daughter at this moment. But something in Michelle's gaze made him realize that the night wasn't over yet. There was one more revelation coming, something she had saved for last. Something that would change not only their lives, but the future of technology forever. The hours following Martin Anderson's arrest were intense. The Halston mansion transformed into an investigation hub, with police officers collecting evidence and investigators cataloging documents. The news crew continued their live broadcast, and the case was quickly becoming the biggest corporate scandal of the year. George watched Michelle give her statement with a mix of pride and concern. She answered the investigators' questions with surprising clarity for her age, explaining how she had realized the connections between her father's notes and Transcorp's actions. But there was something different in her demeanor now, a certain restlessness, as if she was waiting for the right moment to reveal something important. "I think we need to talk," she finally said when the investigators took a break. "In private." George led her to the study, away from the curious eyes of the press and police. Mrs. Thompson accompanied them, carrying the folder with Richard's original documents. "What is it?" George asked, noticing how nervous Michelle seemed. She took a deep breath before answering. "There's something I haven't told you about Dad's work, about why it's so important." Mrs. Thompson sat in one of the armchairs, her attentive eyes fixed on Michelle. "The fake notes I left for Transcorp to find," the girl continued, "weren't totally fake. They were a simplified, incomplete version. But they had a purpose beyond serving as bait." "How so?" George asked, intrigued. Michelle opened her notebook to a specific page. "Dad wasn't just developing a new type of computer or a faster communication system. He discovered something much bigger." She showed a series of equations and diagrams she had drawn. To George's surprise, these were far more complex than the ones she had left for Transcorp to find. "When particles are quantumly entangled," she explained, "they behave as if they're one, no matter the distance between them. Dad discovered a way to use this not only to transmit information, but to change the very nature of reality." George frowned. "How so?" "It's like we can reprogram the very fabric of the universe," she said, her eyes sparkling with contained excitement. "Dad discovered that quantum entanglement isn't just a property of particles, it's the basis of everything. And if we could control it, we could change anything," George completed, beginning to grasp the magnitude of the discovery. "Exactly," Michelle replied. "We could cure diseases at the molecular level, clean up air and water pollution, solve the energy crisis. That's why Transcorp was so desperate. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the power." Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. "That's why your mother kept the notes so carefully. That's why she was so afraid." Michelle nodded. "But there's more. In the past few weeks, studying Dad's notes, I realized something I don't think even he fully realized." She flipped through some pages of her notebook, arriving at even more complex calculations. The alternative method he developed, the one that didn't require the special material, it wasn't just a simpler solution, it was a gateway to something even bigger. George felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I managed to complete his calculations," Michelle said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I discovered that it's possible not only to transmit information instantaneously, but also energy. Pure, clean, infinite energy." The silence that followed was heavy. The implications of what Michelle was saying were enormous, revolutionary even. "Are you sure?" George finally asked. In response, Michelle took something from her pocket. It was a small device, no bigger than a matchbox, made with parts she had clearly assembled using simple materials. "I built this last night," she said. "It's a very basic prototype, but..." She pressed a button on the device. Immediately, all the lights in the study turned on, even though they were switched off. The electronic devices on the desk started working, and the small fan in the corner of the room began to spin. "It's not connected to anything," she explained. "No battery, no wires, It's generating energy directly from the fabric of space-time itself, using the principle Dad discovered. George looked at the small device in awe. My God, this is revolutionary, Mrs. Thompson finished, her voice barely audible. And dangerous. That's why I didn't tell you before, Michelle said. That's why I waited until Transcorp was out of the way, because this can't fall into the wrong hands. It can't be used to make more money or gain more power. She turned off the device, and the lights returned to normal. What do you want to do, then? George asked. Michelle looked at him with that same determination she had inherited from Richard. I want to do what Dad would have done. I want to share this with the world, but in the right way, through universities, research institutes, non-profit organizations, places where it can be used to help people, not to profit from them. George felt tears welling up in his eyes. His niece had not only inherited Richard's genius, she had inherited his heart, his ethics, his vision of a better world. I'll help you, he said. We'll do this together the right way. Michelle smiled, but then her expression turned serious again. There's just one more thing I need to do first. What? I need to visit my father's grave, she said softly. I need to tell him that I did it, that I finished what he started. George nodded, understanding perfectly. I'll take you there first thing in the morning. But as he watched his niece carefully put away the small device that could change the world, George couldn't help but think about how life takes strange turns, how a tragedy from 8 years ago had led to this moment, to this discovery, to this extraordinary child who carried within her the legacy of his brother. The day was dawning outside, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. But there was still one last page of this story to be written. One last tribute to be paid to the man who had started it all with a dream of changing the world through knowledge. The sun was still rising when George and Michelle arrived at the cemetery. The morning dew covered the tombstones with a thin, glistening layer, and the silence was broken only by the soft chirping of birds. Mrs. Thompson accompanied them a few steps behind, carrying a small bouquet of white flowers. Michelle held George's hand tightly as they walked through the marble corridors. In her other arm, she carried her inseparable physics book and the small device she had built. George noticed she was trembling slightly, but her steps were firm and determined. When they reached Richard's grave, they stopped. It was a simple headstone as he would have wanted, with only his name, the dates, and a small inscription. Knowledge is the light that illuminates the path to a better world. Hi, Dad, Michelle said softly, kneeling before the tombstone. It took me a while to come here, I'm sorry, but I think you'd understand why. George felt his throat tighten as he watched his niece talking to the brother she never got to know. Mrs. Thompson discreetly wiped away a tear. You know, Michelle continued, Mom always told me about you, how brilliant you were, how much you loved studying and discovering new things. She kept your notes, your work, and I managed to understand, Dad. I managed to complete what you started. She opened her physics book, taking out the old photo that showed Richard and Irene together at the university. You already knew, didn't you? You already knew that I was going to be like you. That's why you left all those clues in your notes, all those little codes that only someone who thinks like you could understand. George watched as she took the small device out of her pocket. I managed to make it work, Dad. The way you imagined it, but a little different. A way that can help a lot of people. And you know what's most amazing? Say used simple things, things that anyone can find. Because I think that's what you wanted, for everyone to have access to this knowledge, not just rich or powerful people. She placed the device gently on the headstone. The bad people who hurt you won't be able to hurt anyone anymore. They tried to keep your work in secret. They tried to use it to become richer and more powerful. But we didn't let them. Uncle George helped me. He's really cool, you know, just like you said he was, in your notes. George couldn't hold back the tears as he heard that. He didn't know Richard had written about him. Now everyone will know what you discovered, Michelle continued, but not just the scientific part. They'll know that you were a good man who wanted to use knowledge to help people. Mom always said that was your biggest dream. She paused, taking a deep breath. She's gone too, Dad, but she was very brave. She kept your secrets, she protected me, she taught me to love books like you loved them. And now I'm not alone anymore. I have Uncle George and Mrs. Thompson and a lot of good people who want to help me continue your work. Mrs. Thompson approached and placed the white flowers on the grave. Michelle smiled at her before continuing. Did you know that there are already universities wanting to study your discovery? And the best part, they promise to only use it for good things, to help poor people have clean energy, to clean up the environment, to make hospitals work better. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? George knelt beside his niece, putting an arm around her small shoulders. Richard, he said, his voice choked with emotion, you would be so proud of her. Not only for her intelligence, but for her heart. She's exactly like you. Brilliant, determined, and above all, kind. Michelle rested her head on her uncle's shoulder. You know what else, Dad? I'm going to study really hard. I'm going to learn everything I can. And when I grow up, I'm going to be a professor just like you. Because I understood that knowledge really is like that light you talked about. The more we share it, the more it grows, the more it illuminates people's paths. The sun was higher now, its golden rays bathing the cemetery with a soft light. A gentle wind blew, swaying the flowers on the grave. I need to go now, Michelle said, standing up, but I'll come back often. And every time I discover something new, every time I manage to help someone with what I've learned, I'll come and tell you. She touched the headstone one last time, her small fingers tracing the letters of her father's name. I love you, Dad, and I promise I'll make you proud of me. As they turned to leave, George noticed something extraordinary. The small device that Michelle had left on the headstone was glowing softly, emitting a bluish light that seemed to dance in the morning air. Michelle, he's called out, pointing. You turned it on. No, she replied, smiling. I didn't turn anything on. But you know what I think? That some forms of energy don't need buttons or switches. Like love, like knowledge, like the memory of good people who have passed through our lives. George looked at his niece, this extraordinary child who had transformed his life in so many ways, and understood that she was right. Some lights never really go out. They continue to shine through the generations, illuminating new paths, inspiring new discoveries. As they left the cemetery, the sun now shining fully in the sky, George knew that this wasn't an end, but a beginning. Richard's legacy would live on through Michelle, not only in her brilliant mind, but in her generous heart and her determination to make the world a better place. And somewhere, he was sure, Richard was smiling, proud of the daughter he never got to know, but who had inherited much more from him than just his genius. She had inherited his dream of using knowledge to illuminate the path to a better future. Shall we go home? He asked, squeezing Michelle's hand affectionately. Let's go, she replied, smiling. We have a lot of work ahead of us. And so, followed by Mrs. Thompson, uncle and niece walked together under the light of the morning, ready to write the next chapter of their lives, a chapter illuminated by the light of knowledge, love, and the hope that Richard had left as his true legacy.